Okay, so today we're going to talk about introduction to genetics, and we're going to answer the question, why do siblings not look the same? All right, so first, remember that we have chromosomes, and these are wound up sections of DNA. We have 46 of them as humans, and they're in 23 pairs. Now remember, those 23 pairs, one of them came from mom, and one of them came from dad, and on them we have sections of DNA which we call genes. And those genes determine our traits. So those are things about us like hair color, eye color, all of those different features of humans. Now, each one of those homologous pairs has a same gene. So in other words, we have two copies of every single gene. That's going to be very important. So let's take a gene like hair color. Now, you should already know we all don't have the same hair color. We have brown hair, blonde hair, black hair, red hair. We have all different types of hair color. So how does a gene for hair color make all of these different ones? Well, it turns out we have different versions of those genes, and we call those different versions alleles. Each allele has a slightly different DNA sequence and will make a slightly different physical trait. All right, another way to look at this, let's say, think of like a pickup truck gene. All right, when you think pickup truck, there's a certain style of vehicle that is. However, there's a whole lot of different versions of pickup trucks. Ford makes a different version. Chevy makes a version. Toyota makes a version. Ram makes a version. There's a whole bunch of different versions of pickup trucks. So even though pickup truck is a gene, all of these different versions would be alleles. Okay, so for each gene, we can have two alleles. And these can be the same alleles or they can be different. And that's going to be a big thing here in genetics. The other way I like to look at this is with sports. So again, we have our homologous chromosomes. One's from mom, one's from dad. They have the same genes, which in this case means they have the same positions. So I want you to think about this as your mom gave you a team and your dad gave you a team. Both of those teams have the same positions because we're playing the same sport. Now, even though these chromosomes have the same genes, they don't necessarily have the same players. So for every one of these positions, we could actually have a different player. And those different players are different alleles. So if you think of genes like positions and alleles like different players, I think it makes a lot of sense. Okay, now some of these genes are different than, or some of these alleles are different than others. Some of them we call dominant, and I like to think of them as bullies. So all you need is one. If you've got a swing set, all you need is one bully, and he's going to be playing on that swing set. Some alleles are recessive, which means we have to have two in order for them to determine our trait. So you can think about this as the only way a recessive allele gets to play on the swing set is if that dominant allele or that bully is not there. So we're going to show dominant alleles with a big letter and recessive alleles with a small letter, just so we can differentiate between the two when we're writing this stuff down. So let's look at the quarterback gene. Again, I like to use sports. So we've got Tom Brady and we've got this guy Ryan Tannehill. We're going to say Tom Brady is the dominant allele and Ryan Tannehill is the recessive, which means we're going to show Tom Brady with a big letter and Ryan Tannehill with a lowercase letter. Now what that means is if you have Tom Brady on your team, he's going to play. Doesn't matter who else is there, Tom Brady's going to play. Ryan Tannehill, only way he's going to play is if he's the only one you got on your team. All right, so let's look at a couple different scenarios. So I've got one homologous pair from mom and one from dad. And in this case, they both have Tom Brady on their teams. So I would have two big Qs. Well, obviously the dominant's going to play because the dominant's the only one that you got. Now let's say that your mom gave you a team with Tom Brady and your dad gave you a team with Ryan Tannehill. Well, if we were writing this out, we would have a big Q and a little q. And who's going to play? Well, Tom Brady's going to play again because he's the dominant. He's going to be the starter on your team. Now let's say that both your mom and your dad give you Ryan Tannehill. Well, we would write that with little q's, and this is the only way that Ryan Tannehill gets in the game. You don't have a choice. You got to play the recessive. So the recessive plays. All right, we're going to use these fancy terms in order to sort of make sure that we know what we're talking about. So when I use the term genotype, that means what genes you have or what alleles. So that's what I'm going to say, things like if you're big A, big A, big A, or little a, little a, those are your genotypes. And we're always going to use two letters because we have two genes. Now, those genes, remember, determine your traits. So your genotype is going to determine your phenotype. And your phenotype is what you look like. It's your physical form. That's going to be something like, do you have brown hair or do you have blonde hair? So just like DNA, your genes, determines your traits, your genotype determines your phenotype. All right, another way to look at genotype and phenotype, if I have the code F-150, that codes for a specific physical truck. So F-150's genotype, the physical truck itself, that would be the phenotype. iPhone 6s, iPhone 6s Plus. Those are two model numbers, so those indicate two different types of phones, and the physical phones are slightly different. So again, what genotype you are determines what you look like. All right, so let's take an actual case of human genetics. We're going to say the ability to roll your tongue is dominant. That means we're going to use a big R for if you can roll your tongue, that's the dominant allele, and a little r for the recessive allele, meaning that you can't roll your tongue. So let's look at our two homologous chromosomes. So let's say you're big R, big R. Remember, that's your genotype. What's your phenotype going to be? Well, you've got two dominants. The ability to roll your tongue is dominant, so you're going to be able to roll your tongue. Let's say I have one dominant and one recessive. I still have at least one dominant, and remember, all you need is one dominant, so I'm still going to be able to roll my tongue. But let's say you've got two recessives. This is the only way that this can happen, and because you don't even have a dominant, it's going to be the recessive, you're not going to be able to roll your tongue. Now, remember, the big R and the big R little r, both of those genotypes resulted in the same phenotype, and only the little r gave a different phenotype. All right, so we are going to have to use some different terms so that we can kind of talk about genotypes in a way that everybody can sort of understand. So remember, this is our genotype, which genes we have. Now, the two words that we're going to use here are homozygous and heterozygous. And that has to do with whether I have two of the same or two different alleles. So if I have a big R and a little r, those are two different, that's going to be heterozygous. Remember, hetero means different. So if I say someone's heterozygous, you automatically know they've got one dominant and one recessive. But let's think about homozygous. That means I have the same. There's actually two different ways that I can have the same two alleles. I can either have two bigs or two littles. So I can't just say, oh, they're homozygous. You would have to ask me, are they homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive? So we're going to have to indicate that. So if we're big R, I'm going to say that's homozygous dominant. That way you know homozygous, they have the same, dominant, it's two dominants. And if I have two little r's, I'm going to use the term homozygous recessive. I don't have to do that with heterozygous because since there's only two and you know they're different, you automatically know it's one big, one little. All right, so some key points to remember in this introductory phase of genetics. You have two of every gene. they can be slightly different. In other words, I can have different alleles for that gene. Those genes determine our traits. So our genotype, what genes we have, determines our phenotype, what our trait actually is. Some alleles are dominant, so you only need one copy to determine the trait. And some are recessive, meaning they only show up if both copies are recessive. So let's answer that question. Why do siblings not look the same? Well, let's remember, your parents both have two copies of every gene, and they don't necessarily give every offspring the exact same ones. So through the process of meiosis and then sexual reproduction, we can get different mixings of those alleles. And so you may have a completely different combination of alleles than your siblings do. Or another way to say that, you might have a different team than your siblings do. And that is the reason why siblings do not look the same.